Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the Bee's Knees by the Big Cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 7, Day 3. But first let's do our daily punishment. One lung said to another, "We belong together." Key terms for today are Boeing 707s, IBM, dinner club card, McDonald's, TV dinner, TV, televangelist, Disneyland, Betty Friedan, the feminine mystique, pink collar ghetto, cult of domesticity, again, Little Rock 9, Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP, Jackie Robinson, White Citizenship Councils, Brown v. Board of Education, important, Montgomery Bus Boycott, MLK Jr., the SCLC, SNCC, Rosa Parks, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, Dwight D. Eisenhower, drive-in movies, Elvis Presley, I Love Lucy, Earl Warren, and the Declaration of Constitution Principles, also known as the Southern Manifesto. We're going to go over civil rights in the 1950s and cultural continuity in the 1950s. We'll talk about mainstream culture in the 1950s as well. So first, we're going to start off with talking about Dwight D. Eisenhower's record as president. He becomes president in 1952 and remains president until 1960. He did have a leadership style which projected sincerity, fairness, and optimism. However, he was a coward in some regards. He wasn't willing to face confrontation. It took him a long while to go against McCarthy. He hated Joseph McCarthy, but he didn't want to go against him. Also, he had a nuanced let's be honest, he was racist. Like most presidents, he had friends who were African Americans, so cliche, but he didn't want to go against segregation, and he only went against segregation when he was kind of forced to. He advised Truman not to integrate the armed forces in 1948. He criticized President Truman's call for establishing a Fair Employment Practices Commission. He said that Brown v. Board of Education upset the customs and convictions of 22 generations of Americans. He's going to be forced to integrate, he's going to be forced to act at Little Rock High School when Orville Faubus, the governor, ordered the national, refused to integrate the high school. So he felt like he had to support the integration because the governor was defying national laws. Eisenhower will send in the National Guard to get Little Rock High School to be integrated. 9 African Americans will go to Central High School. At first, Orville Faubus would not let him in. They were denying the Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, not because he was against racism, but because Orville Faubus was defying national law. Eisenhower will send in the soldiers. It's going to take U.S. soldiers to actually integrate the high school. These 9 African Americans will be called the Little Rock 9. They're going to be integrated. They're going to face a horrible time. They'll have to have soldiers with them at all times. They'll be isolated. There'll be racism against them. You see this white woman right here. She's shouting the N-word. Years later, she still claimed that what she was doing was right, that these people were outsiders, that what they were doing was wrong. She still was defending herself. Racism. Out of these Little Rock 9, only one of them will graduate. This is a super famous picture right here. But it is like the first example, or one of the first example of Southern schools being integrated, even though it's only 9 people. Here's Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was thought of very positively by most Americans in the 1950s. Let's talk about some of the consumerism of the 1950s. In the election of 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to destroy Adlai Stevenson in the election. He'll do the same thing in 1956. In the 1950s, we'll have a surge in homeownerships, rise of the suburbs like Levittowns. We talked about that before. You're going to have an increase of new technology in America in the 1950s. We have IBM, which is a computer company, which is going to develop. Computers at first were the size of whole rooms. You have a new type of airplane, which is going to be used, the Boeing 707, which is a long-range, narrow-body airliner. It's going to be developed and produced by Boeing Commercial. It's going to be the first jet airliner, and it's going to be used for commercial travel. It's going to be used for a long time. In the 1950s, white-collar jobs, professional jobs, jobs that require education, like secretaries, receptionists, teachers, scientists, are going to start to outnumber blue-collar jobs, like construction workers, factory workers. The 1950s will see a huge expansion in the middle class and blossoming of consumer culture. People are going to start spending things for fun. We're going to have the beginning of credit cards. The first credit card was the Dinner Club, which was created in 1950. We're going to have the opening of fast food industries. One of the first fast food places was McDonald's, which was created in San Bernardino, California. You would go there. The person that created McDonald's, Ray Kroc, made McDonald's like an assembly line of how food was created. The whole idea was it was speedy, it was cheap. You got in, you got out. It's not a restaurant. Disneyland will be opened in 1955, so you have a big idea of the consumer culture from 1950s. In the 1950s, you have easy credit, high volume fast food, and new forms of recreation are going to bring on a new lifestyle. A lot of this lifestyle is very conformist. It's very white. Here's one of the first McDonald's in the 1950s. Opening of Disneyland. Of course, only white people there. The Boeing 707. Let's talk some more about consumer culture. You do have new types of music at this time. You have Elvis and rock and roll. Elvis is going to take some of his musical ideas from African American culture, although some of the African American goes back even further from like their jazz stuff also goes back to other cultural things. So it's really hard to say who stole from who. But Elvis becomes very popular with the younger generation in the 1950s, and he was seen as kind of a rebel, although he became very conservative later on in life. You have the mass buying and consumption of the television. The television is going to play an important role of American culture in the 1950s. Over 7 million sets will be sold. By 1960, almost everybody has a television. You're going to have the TV dinner being created where people can eat and watch TV at the same time. You're going to have drive-in movies where young kids could go to the drive-in movies, make out and whatever, hang out with their friends and their girlfriend they're going steady with. And woo! Television is going to bring together the commercialization of professional sports. You have professional sports being televised, advertisements. You have Christians, televangelists that'll be preaching on Sunday. They'll be asking for donations, televangelism. You have new types of sitcoms coming in the 1950s, like I Love Lucy, which was a satire of an American home wife, Lucille Ball, and her husband, Ricky Ricardo. The Honeymooners, Leave It to Beaver, which talks about life in the 1950s. Leave It to Beaver, very satir. It is kind of funny, but it's not very risque or anything. The big problem Beaver might have is he loses his homework, something like that. So very much predominant culture in the 1950s, these sitcoms. TV dinner. There's Elvis. Drive-in. I Love Lucy. Let's talk about women in the 1950s. There will be a post-war cult of domesticity. Leave It to Beaver mothers who raise their kids, have children, cook, clean. There are going to be new clerical jobs for women in the 1950s. So some women are going to be leaving the house for part of the time. But this is going to lead to the pink collar ghetto. The pink collar ghetto is a gender term where women are working full-time or part-time, but they're still expected to cook, clean, and take care of the whole house as well. So it's a ghetto for them. One of the big books that's going to be created in 1963, but it's kind of relevant in the 1950s, is Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique is going to talk about what life is like for women. It's a classic example of feminine protest literature, kind of similar to Uncle Tom's Cabin as an abolitionist protest literature. It's going to lead to the feminist movement. It's a really important book. It talked about the boredom of housewifery, how women are bored, and it's going to really push for more opportunities for women, equal rights, social and economic equality. Women have the right to vote, but they definitely do not have social or economic equality. And this book is really going to lead to the women's rights movement, the second wave of feminism. Here's some pictures of the cult of domesticity. We talked about the cult of domesticity all the way to the 1800s, so you do see some differences here, especially with appliances. Here's some memes of cult of domesticity. Oh, look how happy she is. Oh my God. A clustered house equals a clustered mind, and a clustered mind interferes with your wifely duties. This is satire. Oh, yep. Yep, they're all smiling because their husbands will beat them if they don't. Obviously, not a lot of equality for women in the 1950s. These are all cult of domesticity pictures. What is that doing there? Oh, yeah, my wife's definitely not cult of domesticity. Let's talk about civil rights for African Americans now in the 1950s. Jim Crow laws, black codes were still around after World War II. A lot of African Americans were very upset because they had just fought to overthrow dictatorship in Europe. Only 20% of blacks could vote in the South. In some states, it was as low as 5%. The southern states, in some of the southern states, they formed white citizenship councils, which were racist groups that were meant to prevent African Americans from having equal rights. It's the more cleansed version of the KKK. There is going to be some post-war progress made in the North. Jackie Robinson will be the first professional baseball player who's African American. There will be more equal access to public accommodations in the North, although they did do like the white flight. We talked about the Double V campaign during World War II, and Harry Truman will desegregate the army. In 1950, the Supreme Court said in Sweatt v. Painter that separate professional schools were not equal. It's not going to fully get rid of segregation, but we'll talk about that next. In 1944, white primaries were ruled unconstitutional, so there is some slow progress. Segregation. Here's the big thing that's going to really start to lead to the civil rights movement, Brown v. Board of Education. We talked about in the 1890s Plessy v. Ferguson that ruled that segregation was okay if it was separate but equal. Under Dwight D. Eisenhower, Earl Warren, who was a governor of California, is going to be made Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a liberal Republican. He's going to become a judicial activist and not the conservative everybody thought. His most famous ruling is Brown v. Board of Education. This is going to rule in a 9-0 decision. It's going to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. It's going to say that segregation was inherently unequal. Separate but equal does not work. Thurgood Marshall was the lawyer that argued in behalf of the NAACP against Plessy v. Ferguson. He argued for Linda Brown and Brown v. Board of Education. This was actually in Kansas where they had segregation, but it's going to apply to everybody. They argued that segregation was unconstitutional and it was not separate but equal. They used studies that showed that African American girls in the 1950s, if they were given a choice between white dolls and African American dolls, they chose white dolls. And that's just horrible, man. Like, segregation is so bad, obviously, but it just it mentally screws up people, and it's evil. The Southerners are not going to be happy about this. Brown v. Board of Education overrules Plessy v. Ferguson. It says the South needs to desegregate with all deliberate speed, but it doesn't say what that means. So the South is going to try to resist this. Southern congressmen are going to pass the Declaration of Constitutional Principles, the Southern Manifesto, which says that they will resist desegregation. Obviously, they don't remember the Civil War. Here's Thurgood Marshall right here. This is going to really lead to the beginning of the civil rights movement. One of the first things we have is going to be the Montgomery crisis and the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Rosa Parks in 1955 was on a bus. She was tired. Part of this was also pre-planned because they wanted to challenge Montgomery's, the NAACP wanted to challenge Montgomery, Alabama's segregation policies, which they shouldn't have anymore because of Brown v. Board of Education. She's going to refuse to move to the back of the bus when some white people want her seat. She's going to be arrested and found guilty. After this, Martin Luther King Jr., who was the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was a group of African American Christian pastors, was formed in 1957 to mobilize black churches on behalf of civil rights. He's going to lead a boycott of Montgomery, Alabama. All African Americans are going to refuse to use the buses in Montgomery until they desegregate the buses. African Americans will start car riding. They'll start carpooling. They'll start taking bikes. They're going to boycott this economically. One of the big key things you need to know about MLK was he believed in nonviolent civil disobedience. So boycotts, strikes, marches, that's what he did. He wanted to shame the country through love and peaceful means to turn them away from their racism. Eventually, the Supreme Court will rule that Montgomery's actions were unconstitutional, and Montgomery's going to lose so much money they will desegregate the buses. So early victory for civil rights. Here are the African Americans during the Montgomery crisis biking to work. Here is Rosa Parks. Here's Martin Luther King Jr. during this time. He was threatened a lot during this time. Throughout his life, he had his house blown up. People tried to kill him a lot. He was hated by the South, even though he did believe in nonviolence. You're going to have an increased push for civil rights after this. There's going to be a sit-in movement in 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, at Woolsworth. Woolsworth was kind of like a grocery store / pharmacy place, kind of like Walgreens or CVS, but they also sold soda counters, and they sold sandwiches and stuff, so you can actually get food there. In 1960, a new civil rights group called the Students Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, is going to give more focus. They're going to do a sit-ins movement where they sit in at the segregated whites-only section of the Woolsworth lunch counter. They refuse to leave. They're going to then get arrested and beat up and stuff, but it was meant to show what was going on there. Over time, SNCC will become more radical, and they're going to actually embrace violence, but not yet. In 1957, Eisenhower and the Republicans and Democrats, some Democrats, the Northern Democrats, will pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Senator Strom Thurmond, who was a Democrat Southerner from South Carolina, will filibuster it, longest filibuster in American history. The Civil Rights Act will pass, though. It's going to set up a Civil Rights Commission to investigate civil rights violations. It's going to authorize the government to do federal injunctions to protect voting rights, but it doesn't really have a lot of enforcement power, so it's not going to really do a lot until later on. Here are the African Americans at the sit-in protest at Woolsworth in North Carolina. Here are the white people going crazy, and there's actually some white people, some college people from the North who are with them, who are also protesting. You're going to start to see some college Northerners coming to the South and helping in the protest. And these are the white Southerners in the background going crazy, being racist, horrible human beings, throwing food, pouring stuff on them. Honestly, they're lucky they're not killing them during this protest. All right, kiddos, and that's all I have for you for today. Next class, we'll talk about the domestic and foreign policy accomplishments of Dwight D. Eisenhower of the 1950s and the counterculture. Until next time, deuces, deuces, yeah.